said, move towards closing. And again, I started this introduction with the Noam Chomsky's, and Tyra Abdullah incidentally mentioned Noam Chomsky's. I will start the closing also with one of his, which in fact also touches the point which Dr. Taimur made. The last paradox is that the tale of Palestinians from the beginning until today is a simple story of colonialism and dispossession. Yet the world treats it as a multifaceted and complex story, hard to understand and even harder to solve. I mean, after looking at this history, what Dr. Taimur just illustrated, it becomes pretty clear that there are lots of powers. It is in their interest to keep this a very complex, you can actually, this issue as a very complex issue, you can bring it down basically, as Dr. Taimur very nicely illustrated, to a simple story of colonialism and dispossession. As long as you do not address these fundamental issues of colonialism, dispossession, taking the territories, driving them out of their home, not giving them basic rights, it is hard to resolve any of these issues. And this is the illustration of what Dr. Taimur has said repeatedly in our discussion. This is a pretty simple illustration. It's actually a no-brainer. You don't even need to read any text. If you just simply look at it, this is the history of colonization, dispossession, exploitation, and ever-shrinking right to exist for Palestinians. Now, how this could be a viable state or a viable nation even, or in viability in any sense, in economic terms, in social terms, in political terms, in territorial terms, so there can never be. But this is not the whole story, because then there is another element to it, which is the apartheid part of it. Because if we look at the Rome Institute, the definition of the crime of apartheid, as they say it, is the inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining the regime. So if you look exactly, this was more about South Africa, but if you apply this to today's situation, we see exactly the same kind of segregation in occupied territories or whole of Israel, which is achieved through implementation of two separate legal regimes for Jewish Israelis and the Palestinians living in the same area. So there are two kinds of people living in the same area, but the settlers, the people who are occupied those territories, they are governed by Israeli civil law, and the people who are occupied, i.e. the Palestinians, they are ruled or governed by the military law. So you have in the same territory, so this could be probably the best illustration of apartheid. Another definition of apartheid in South Africa was a former social system in South Africa in which Black people and people from other racial groups did not have the same political and economic rights as white people, and were forced to live separately from white people. Now, in this case, if you just replace South Africa with Israel, and Black people with Palestinians, it has an absolute match and a total fit with the situation we are facing today. And now let's summarize this, what Dr. Taimur was talking about. And I think he very clearly explained to us, with a lot of evidence, in fact, historical evidence, that Jewish faith and Zionism are two different things. And also explained to us very well that if we kind of condemn Jewish faith and turn this into a religious conflict, we actually strengthen the hands of the occupiers. So it is a story of not of religions, but of occupation, expansion, and the violation of liberty of a complete people. There is a total power asymmetry. Therefore, you can't even, Palestinians are not even in a position to dictate anything or sit down and negotiate, because the power asymmetry you see on the visual of on the left, if a kid is throwing stones at the most powerful and most innovative tank, this is the power symmetry more or less we have. And then the framing of violence by Israel as self-defense. If we look at Holocaust, and again, it was explained very well, that it was one of the most tragic events in the history. Absolutely right. But framing the violence now in Israel against Palestinians and packaging it as self-defense and using the same Holocaust, which was a tragic event, marketing it to kind of put Palestinians in the bad light and the rest of the world, whoever criticizes. So you dehumanize Palestinians, and every critic in the world of Zionism or Israeli politics, not Jews, but Israeli politics, is met with a bombardment of anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. So I just mentioned the two parallel justice systems, which is clearly the apartheid. And Palestinians are never considered a part of the solution. They are always part of the problem. Whenever anyone in the world, or most of the powers in the world, they sit together and talk about the solution, the Palestinians are a problem, not any other party. And if we look at the narrative now within Israel, where al-Nakba was replaced by the narrative of people without land, and and the Palestinians were people with, the Palestinian territory was a territory without people, and Jews or Israelis were people without land, so they just came and took the empty land. And this has been a kind of, and it is absolutely not true. You heard from Dr. Temur that al-Nakba or the catastrophe, it was actually mass exodus of 750,000 Palestinians who hoped that they will be back next week. So we leave it actually with all this explanation to your imagination and your own conclusions. Is this a battle of religions? And if we framed it as a battle of religions, is it going to be a good thing for Palestinians, or is it going to be a bad thing for Palestinians? So it's really up to us to kind of decide on this point. Other aspect, and Dr. Thamu very nicely mentioned about the human rights, that people treated equally in the same territory governed by the same law. So if we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it talks about dignity, which is right of every person, dignity, liberty, and equality. And that talks about right to life and the prohibition of slavery and torture, freedom of movement, the right of property and the right to a nationality, spiritual, public, and political freedoms, freedoms of thought, opinion, expression, religions, and conscience, economic freedom, social and cultural rights, including healthcare. Now, this is a very short list from the 30 articles of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is right of every human being. Again, it's up to you to decide how many of the above rights, which are mentioned and accepted universally by all countries, how many of these above rights do the Palestinians enjoy? So we can see that, and certainly they cannot enjoy in the current situation when they are occupied and Israel has been declared as the nation, as a Jewish state.